have a discussion about South Africa now being an attractive mining investment destination. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on this, and maybe you can set the scene for us.
South Africa is well endowed with mineral resources. However, in today's times, to attract investors, it's going to take more than just offering good resources. So we need a stable and clear regulatory framework, which we have to some extent, and we also need to promote exploration and prospecting. This is because our country has a mature mining industry. And so if you want to have a successful mining industry well into the future, you need to be promoting exploration.
I definitely agree with you on that. I would just add that South Africa, for me, is an attractive investment destination, especially for those investors who are now concerned with ESG factors. With our heavy reliance on fossil fuels and coal for electricity, the eyes of the world are on South Africa to see whether we can transition to a low-carbon economy. The move towards a just transition and a green pandemic recovery in South Africa creates opportunities for socially responsible and sustainable entrepreneurs in South Africa. South Africa is well endowed with natural resources, as you say, but especially those resources that are critical for the transition to a low-carbon economy. We also have solid infrastructure and a robust regulatory framework, as I think you will go into in a little bit, with respect to transformation and social transformation in particular, as well as a sustainable development regulatory framework. Our legislation already takes into account various ESG factors.
Sure. So I think it's actually kind of a paradox because the mining industry is often seen as a polluter, but with this transition to a low-carbon economy, we're actually going to be needing mining companies to be producing these types of all sorts of minerals in order to enable the transition and to also offer clean technology.
So in terms of the E, there are critical minerals that will be required for the clean energy technology in achieving net zero that South Africa is well endowed in. For example, the rise of renewable energy and electric vehicles will require more nickel, more graphite, more cobalt, more manganese, and more lithium. An electric car, as an example, will require 6 times the mineral input of a conventional car, and onshore wind plants require 9 times more mineral resources than a gas-fired power plant. So, as you mentioned, there's actually a lot more mineral resources required to produce renewable energy. And so in the short term, for sure, and maybe even the medium to long term in achieving that net zero target, there will be investment and an increased demand in those natural resources that are required for renewable energy projects and electric vehicles. It's important that South Africa harnesses the minerals that it does have, because it doesn't necessarily have everything. For example, lithium, Zimbabwe has a much greater share than South Africa, but there are deposits in South Africa that are underexplored and that would need to be explored. In addition to that, I think that mining and exploration would have to go hand in hand with building up the capabilities of a manufacturing sector and reinforcing that manufacturing sector.
In the mining space already, you have the MPRDA that requires holders of mining titles to have a social and labor plan in place that will speak to how mining companies are going to empower communities, and the mining charter as well, which has various elements that speak to empowering host communities and not leaving them worse off. So we do have elements of the S in ESG already in our framework. And I think it's important for mining companies to realize that now more than ever, they will need to be partnering with communities. So they will need to be meaningfully engaging with them to ensure that they have the social license to operate.
When it comes to the S element in ESG, I think that South Africa is uniquely placed given its history and context of historic injustice and the legislative imperative for transformation. It is really ideally placed for social empowerment projects and investment in these projects. In terms of the BE and the mining sector and social transformation, these are investments with respect to the S elements, and community empowerment projects via SLPs, creates immense opportunities for local communities. There's also opportunities there to empower local communities with respect to mine rehabilitation. Because as we know, there are many mines in South Africa that are nearing their end of life or that are becoming stranded assets. And so these assets can be harnessed and used by local communities to promote economic growth for the local communities. And mining companies also remain very important in plugging certain gaps in certain areas where their communities don't actually have access to water supply and access to electricity. And so there's definitely a role there for mines to utilize their roles in those communities to actually provide good. And so that as a social investment is really important for investors in the ESG inquiry.
As you've mentioned, South Africa already has a robust environmental and mining legislation that actually enables mining companies to factor ESG considerations when they conduct their operations. And so really, I think the duty is on the mining companies to ensure that they implement these things. And over and above that, I think the call to transition to a low carbon economy actually will require mining companies to be producing and mining.
When it comes to the G element for governance, I think that South Africa has its challenges for sure. We are dealing with state capture with the State Commission inquiry, but there's also a lot of positives that I would take away when it comes to the G element. For example, South Africa's regulatory framework is really solid as a foundation and really robust. So when it comes to the energy sector, we're starting to see some opening ups of the energy sector, and what has been traditionally highly regulated and centralized is now slowly but surely starting to become a little bit less centralized and less, opening up in terms of the markets. And so an example of that would be the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, which shows our ability as South Africa to be able to implement a competitive bidding process, which was very successful. And the other success of that was that we were able to actually introduce renewable energy to a coal-dominated energy sector, which I think is very positive. There are opportunities as well in renewable energy for partnerships between South African companies and international foreign investors. And so I think that this should also be harnessed. I think that there is a lot of solid regulation in place for sustainability in the mining sector with NEMA, and actually complying and enforcing that legislation. I think government is trying to do a lot better with that. And just as recently, I think as last week, there was a mine closure strategy that was produced by government. And so I think that government, there's a political will, and impetus and recognition to recognize the flaws, but also to take the regulatory regimes with respect to mining and energy to the next stage. I think that when it comes to these policy documents, we've seen a hydrogen roadmap, we've seen a green transport roadmap, we've seen a renewable energy master plan in the workings. There's talk of an exploration strategy, and there's an ESCOM roadmap. And I think that these documents really suggest that there is a political will to reform, and there are planned and concerted objectives with these documents. So I think that any investor would be looking to an environment that is a solid regulatory framework that is conducive to investment. And I think that South Africa is really trying to do better when it comes to that.
Sure. So I think the process for applying for mining titles is very clear and straightforward. And I think the minister recently announced that they will be improving the online system to ensure that it's more efficient. So we do have that. But over and above that, I do think that, there are still some challenges with our regulatory framework. For example, issues with the mining charter. Just about 3 weeks ago, the court was there were hearings in respect of the judicial review application. And so it'll be interesting to see how where the court lands on that, and also in terms of going forward, how government is going to be regulating transformation. With financial provisioning, I think that the issue is that we've had these extensions, and we just don't know at what point are they going to settle on the correct regulations. In 2019, we had the draft regulations, and to date, we still haven't settled, or the industry hasn't agreed on a compromise. And so it's going to be important for government going forward to ensure that they achieve a certainty in that respect.
Thank you so much, Zinzi, for this very thought-provoking and interesting conversation. I think that we have a lot to be quite excited about, but I think that there are challenges, and we should be frank about those challenges and be working together as industry and government to try and get to a better place.
Thank you, Dalit. That was a very interesting conversation, and I'm very excited about the future of the South African mining industry. It's not all doom and gloom, as you say, so it'll be very interesting to see how things pan out in the future.